somebody who's really thought a lot about Ray's work, and he offered to introduce 2 films in our series this summer, and I was really delighted by that. I know he's put a lot of time into preparing some remarks, so I'd just like you to help me in a warm welcome.
Thank you, Susan. Let me just get my timer out here. I don't want to stand between a great movie and... Okay. Thank you. I'm excited to be back at the PFA to introduce the second Felunath movie. Some of you may have seen the one last week, Sonar Kella, or the Golden Fortress. Satyajit Ray wrote this story. It's the 11th of his 40-odd Felunath stories in 1975. The movie was made 3 years later. By this time, he was churning out about every year about 1 story each of his 2 main creations. There's a gentleman detective called Felunath, who's the hero of this movie, and a scientist called Professor Shonku, along with other short stories for children. Both Felunath and Shonku were inspired by characters from Arthur Conan Doyle, who was one of Ray's very favorite writers when he was a kid. Felunath is the Calcutta version of Sherlock Holmes, while Shonku comes from Professor Challenger of the Lost World. The stories, published usually in the Durga Puja festival special editions of some well-known Bengali magazines, and later in books, would be Ray's primary source of income. Let me talk a bit about Durga Puja, since it's a very important part of the movie that we are about to see. Durga Puja is a Hindu festival in September or October, celebrating the victory of the goddess Durga over the demon Mahishasur. In Hindu myth, the holy trinity of gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, together created a divine female power, goddess Durga, to defeat this half-human and half-buffalo demon. She has 10 arms and rides a lion into battle. She's quite the thing, though you'll see it here as an idol. Unfortunately, she's the only female character, real or imagined, in this movie. And that's one of the things I always felt about the Felunath stories. Now, each year, just to talk a little more about the Durga Puja, each year, new clay idols are created by specialized idol makers, and giant structures made of bamboo and cloth and tarp are created to house the idols. The celebrations last 5 days, culminating in the idol being immersed. Bengalis across the world celebrate this festival, and we have about 3 of these that I know of in the Bay Area. Growing up, this was pretty much what we look forward to the whole year. A magical time with a sense of infinite possibilities in the air. And it was a time to get together with friends, and there was no school, and it's part of a pretty big holiday. It's like combining Thanksgiving and New Year's and Christmas all together, with a little bit of a Burning Man with all the temporary structures that you see all around you. Interestingly, though, even though Ray would get the stories out at Puja, the movies would always be released in winter, because Ray was very worried about the lack of air conditioning in Indian movie theaters in the 70s and 80s. He was quite obsessed about it, and he talks about how his movie-going experience would be spoiled because the sound of the fans, and if you've seen movies from back then. So coming back to this movie, the same trio is here as in Sonar Kella, but now as a more established unit. Felunath's young cousin Topshe is almost as tall as him, if you have seen the last movie. And by the way, last week I inadvertently referred to him as, referred to Felunath as Topshe's uncle, and I want to correct that. I meant to say that there's such a large age difference between the 2 of them that he's more of an uncle than an elder brother or a cousin. Lalmohan Ganguly, who's known in the crime fiction world by his nom de plume Jatayu, a mythic bird from the Indian epic Ramayana, provides some of the comic relief. So he's the 3rd person in the trio. In fact, I'm wearing my Felunath t-shirt, which I found in my unwashed clothes from 100 years ago. I was too worried it'll shrink. Now, to explain who Felunath is, I'll use this quote from a friend of Ray's. and I quote here, "Feluda is an encyclopedia of literature, art, linguistics, geology, anthropology, iconography, and history. Feluda loves travel and longs to add to his enormous knowledge of the world." In fact, he's Ray's own alter ego. If one day it becomes essential to discuss Feluda in order to understand Ray, it should not come as a surprise. And Ray himself told his biographer, Andrew Robinson, "I'm sure there's a lot of me in him, but I can't tell you to what extent." In fact, Ray even casts his own movie alter ego, Soumitra Chatterjee, in the two Feluda movies. Like Sonar Killa, which was set in Rajasthan, that's the Golden Fortress, the previous movie, there's a palpable sense of place. And in this case, the place is the ancient Hindu city of Benares in northern India, on the banks of the holy river Ganges. I'll talk a little bit about Benares. It's kind of germane to this movie. Buddhism was founded nearby Benares in the 6th century BC, and over the years it has been ruled by Hindus as well as Muslim dynasties, and attracted seekers across the world, including Mark Twain and Allen Ginsberg in different times. It would have been great to have them together. In 1897, Twain wrote, this is after he visited, I quote, "Benares is older than history, older than tradition, older even than legend, and looks twice as old as all of them put together." But this print is new, so it looks very, very fresh. Much of the architecture that one sees in the movie was built in the last 300 to 400 years. And there's for Hindus, it's a very holy place. And if you die in Benares, you are supposed to be released from the endless cycle of rebirth. And by bathing in the Ganges, you can wash away all your mortal sins. And in fact, in this movie, you'll see a lot of that going on. Bengalis have immigrated to Benares for centuries, and the well-to-do ones have built houses for their religious trips. In fact, this movie was shot in some of those houses. Ray had shot early scenes from Aparajito, the Unvanquished, that's the second of his Ray trilogy, at Benares about 22 years before this. And there's a scene of Apu's father dying, and there'll be another scene in this movie which might remind you a lot of that in the composition and the camera going back. Yeah, let me not give away too much. And one of the pleasures of this movie is seeing the same place in color through the eyes of Soumitra Chatterjee, the actor who plays both the adult Apu and also plays Feluda. But this isn't the only self-referencing that happens. Jatayu is the pulp writer. He's going through a dry creative phase, and he's bothered by the popularity of his chief rival in the detective fiction world. And there's a child here who pretends to be a detective, and he's the one who's a fan of Jatayu's rival. And this child pretends to be a detective, and he also has an assistant. There is a death scene, which is set to a nonsense rhyme written by Ray's father. And of course, the story is set in Durga Puja and is published and written at and came out at Durga Puja time. So there's this whole meta thing going on here. We also meet Feluda's Moriarty. He's a trader called Maganlal Meghraj, who appears in 3 more of the stories. Meghraj is played by the legendary Bengali stage actor Utpal Datta. And watching him play a crooked businessman is a delight. And there's this, and he's appeared in many other Ray movies. If you've seen John Arundel, which is the middleman, he plays the guy who introduces our hero to the world of being the middleman. And there's a scene towards the end of this movie when Utpal Datta, Maganlal Meghraj, is coming down the Ganges in a barge. And it's somewhere in between a regal Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra and a hustling Mark Twain on a Mississippi riverboat. It's a great scene. The broader crime in this movie, which is illegally selling historical art to foreign buyers, was a real problem for India at that time. But equally in Ray's sight is religious duplicity. Meghraj's lair is covered by religious iconography, and a fake god-man, a holy man, has settled in the banks of the Ganges. And ever the rationalist, Ray is brutal in his unmasking. There isn't the tragic delusion of Devi, or the goddess, which deals with a similar theme, or the raucous humor of Mahapurush, the holy man, where there is this Birinchi Baba who's unmasked. But tradition here is laced with corruption. And at the end, you see Felunath as this vengeful god. And it's one of my favorite scenes in Ray's movies. Joy Baba Felunath is a classic whodunit. And unlike the more expansive Shonarkella, it also flows easier because it is set in one place. Ray himself wrote a letter to a young fan, and he explains, I can't compare the two films because they are of very different temperaments. The mind travels far in Shonarkella. There isn't that in Joy Baba Felunath. And also the whole affair with Mukul had a touch of romanticism. Joy Baba Felunath is much tighter, city-based, cleverer, but I enjoyed making both movies. Like in Shonarkella, the use of color is again brilliant, and this restored version will show that. Ray was very careful in his costumes and sets because he didn't want to do any post-production work on color. At the same time, there's a scene in a dark alley at night, and that could be straight out of Third Man or a Fritz Lang noir movie. And this, in my opinion, was the last great Ray movie. His health started deteriorating after that, and he was not able to do the kind of location shooting that he thrived in. For this movie, for example, he spent 13 days in Benares. Ray didn't make any more Feluda movies after this. The actor who plays Jatayu, he died, and Soumitra Chatterjee, who plays Feluda, is obviously quite old by that time, and you can see that he's wearing a wig. His son, Ray's son, made some more Feluda movies, but they're nowhere near these two in quality. Now, like many others in my generation, I grew up on Ray's stories. Feluda was a hero to us. We all aspired to be observant and intelligent like him. And just as the Shonku stories were the first time we saw a scientist as a hero. And as one sees this film, the many facets of Ray's genius come out. He's an author, a composer, a graphic artist. In fact, these title cards that we'll see in the movie in a few minutes, and there's a lot of these writings, signs on the wall, graffiti on the wall, and he created those himself. And I became familiar with Ray's contemporaries, Fellini, Kurosawa, Antonioni, and Bergman, etc., when I went to college in Calcutta, in fact, the same college that Ray went, Yale. And I used to run a film society there. But those movies, I never could see them when I was 7 years old because it's kind of difficult to understand Antonioni even when you are 40 years old. But whereas Ray's movies really spoke to you, it appealed to you as any cinegoer in any age would like that movie. And I was very fortunate that I got on this path of really liking movies because of this very beautiful movie that I saw at this very young age. And I hope this beauty will still be visible to all of you today after 35 years. Thank you.